Welcome back. Last time, I did a broad analysis on Super Mario World. Now, let's take a deeper look at the game's starting minutes while also talking about the level design in general. As soon as you turn the game on, you're treated with a demonstration of gameplay that very quickly showcases most of what Mario can do in this game. Running, grabbing shells, and especially Yoshi. This gives the player an idea of what's possible in the game. When players start a new game, they are treated to a small text introduction that quickly explains the plot. The Game Boy Advance remake adds a cutscene to the start of the game that explains pretty much the same in a non-verbal way, but it also keeps the original one. After the introduction text, Mario is let loose at Yoshi's Island. This small area works as a step forward from the self-contained worlds of Mario 3. It is, by itself, much smaller than the first world of the previous game, but it clearly has more than one exit. The possibility of going through the game by many different paths is one of the biggest selling points of Mario World, and the game immediately makes it clear by putting a sign pointing left and right just above Mario. Mario starts at Yoshi's house. If the player enters it, it is a one-screen big area with nothing other than an information block containing a message from Yoshi. This area can give the player some time to get used to the controls in a perfectly safe environment if they so desire. This is similar to the castle grounds in Super Mario 64, for example. As for real levels, there are two levels that can be immediately accessed from the start. Yoshi's Island 1 to the left and 2 to the right. Contrary to what you might think, the most appropriate first level here is not the one that is marked as level 1. Not only will most people tend to move right to get to the first level, Yoshi's Island 2 is much more suited to new players. Compare what happens if you enter Yoshi's Island 1 and wait, to what happens if you enter Yoshi's Island 2 and wait. Not only is the first numbered level much harder, it is also optional. The second level is much more well suited to a player who has no idea of what's going on, and is the one that actually puts Mario closer to the end of the game. This makes the game further reinforce the fact that players can choose their own path. Before we start looking into Yoshi's Island 2 though, some general comments about Mario World's levels. Much like Mega Man, Mario levels are organized around areas with a certain type of challenge that increases gradually in difficulty. As the game has over 70 levels, there is a very wide variety of enemies and obstacles that help keep things fresh even in later worlds. There are even quite a few enemies that only show up in a handful of levels. In recent Mario games, the levels are designed using a 4-step method called Kisho Tenketsu. In very basic terms, this means building a level by introducing a concept, exploring it with harder elements, followed by a twist and a wrap-up. Super Mario World was developed over 15 years before the Kisho Tenketsu idea solidified, but it is already possible to see something similar coming into existence. Most levels are short and composed of only one or two types of challenge. Take Yoshi's Island 4, for example. Save for an extra area, the whole level is based around navigating this river while jumping on those floating platforms, gradually increasing difficulty by throwing those spiked balls with increased frequency as the level progresses. Some levels will mostly alternate between two types of enemies, like Cookie Mountain, which is mostly composed around increasingly chaotic combinations of Monty Mouse with a few Sumo Bros and Sliding Koopas scattered throughout. Other levels will run with one idea up to the checkpoint and then change things up. Cheese Bridge area, for example, has its first half based on avoiding these saws while riding a moving platform, and its second half based on holding on to moving ropes to cross the gaps between platforms. The level ends by joining those two concepts and having the player dodge the saws while climbing on a rope. Finally, some levels will have many areas with different stuff happening in each, like Vanilla Dome 1. This level has spinies, bats, a stretch full of buzzy beetles where Mario has to use a shell or the cape to progress, a jump over a paratroopa, a whole area where the player needs to run on a platform that is sinking in lava, followed by a final area where the plumber needs to navigate narrow passages with a few jumps over pipes in between. Overall, Mario World's levels are certainly less focused than their more modern counterparts, but still much more than, for example, Mega Man's levels. there is also already a great deal of variety, with almost every level being very unique and memorable. Still, as levels reuse concepts and enemies much more than the ones in recent games, it is also harder to observe an increasing difficulty throughout a single level, with that being more visible by comparing earlier areas with the later ones. With all that in mind, let's start looking at the game's more likely first level, Yoshi's Island 2. The level begins with Mario at the very left of a completely empty screen, left free to play around with the controls. Once the player moves right, Mario comes upon a lone empty shell on the floor and a platform with a bunch of red Koopas. This is one thing that sets this game apart from the rest of the series, the focus on Koopa Troopas. In basically every other game in the series, the bulk of Bowser's forces is made up of the fragile Goombas. In the original Super Mario Bros., much like in this one, Mario starts in an empty screen but finds a Goomba after walking a little. While Super Mario World does have Goombas, they're only found in a handful of stages, while the Koopas are found in basically every stage that is not a haunted house. The Koopas in this game are designed in a way that allows them to take advantage of every single one of Mario's abilities. They can be forcefully ejected from their shells by a jump, they can be killed by a spin jump or a Yoshi jump, the empty shells can be used as a projectile, they are flipped around by the cape's attack, allowing Mario to use the shell as a projectile with the turtle still inside, like in most other games, and they are immediately killed by a fireball. Koopas also come in 4 different colors. Like every other Mario game, there are the basic green Koopas, who just move forward, and the red Koopas, who turn back at the end of platforms. This game also has yellow and purple Koopas. The yellow Koopas behave like green Koopas, but if an ejected Koopa enters a yellow shell, they become an invincible spinning shell. Purple Koopas act like red Koopas, but move faster and, when ejected, start kicking shells back instead of entering them. The Koopa colors also interact with Yoshi in interesting ways when they are held in its mouth. Green shells do nothing special, but red shells turn into 3 fireballs when spit, yellow shells make Yoshi stomp on the floor and damage nearby enemies, and purple shells give Yoshi wings that can be used to fly. For the last 2, note that Yoshi can only hold a shell in its mouth for a limited amount of time, which keeps them from being too overpowered. As you can see, the Koopas in this game are designed from the ground up to be a versatile enemy that can be used in any sort of situation, even more if you consider the flying variations. By having them interact in some way with every single one of the player's actions, the developers give more purpose to Mario's extra abilities. As a bonus, they also come out with an enemy that can save a lot on development time simply because it is so versatile. Anyway, back to the level proper. The very first thing that Mario encounters on his way is an empty Koopa shell. This is actually a rather rare sight in this game, and has been placed here to teach the player how to interact with those without the risk of being damaged by a Koopa. If the player simply walks into the shell, as most new players would, Mario kicks it away. If the player already knows how to run, which is highly unlikely for a first-time player, Mario grabs the shell. You might have noticed that the group of red Koopas appears as soon as the player reaches the empty shell. Note that these are red Koopas, not green, meaning they will bounce back from the edge of the platform and from each other. This means that, unless the player specifically wants to pick a fight with the turtles, they will be perfectly safe. For those who do decide to go for the Koopas, the number of Koopas is exactly the number needed for the player to score an extra life if they are all defeated by this shell. Moving forward, we now have the first 2 interrogation blocks, with a strange dashed square in the middle. This is another one of the game's new features. Blocks of certain colors activated by finding secret areas with the matching switch. The yellow switch palace is the first one to be found and the only one in plain sight. Having this in the middle of 2 normal blocks makes it as clear as possible that those are gonna become solid sooner or later, if they're not already. The game is perfectly beatable without those blocks, but they are notably present over a lot of otherwise bottomless pits, or, like here, placed to give players extra power-ups. This gives the player an extra incentive to seek out the switch palaces, as that will make the game easier, while also giving those who seek greater challenge the option to ignore them. It is worth noting that the very next level, Yoshi's Island 3, is a massive difficulty spike without activating the yellow switch, something that was probably done to direct less experienced players into doing Yoshi's Island 1 after this one and then activating the switch. A little further ahead, there is another raised platform similar to the one with all the Koopas earlier, but this one is shorter and empty. It was probably placed here both to fill the empty space and to allow the player to play around with Mario's jump on a safe platform, letting the player know this particular kind of platform can be jumped on from underneath. Right after this platform, we have two more interrogation blocks positioned even lower, practically begging the player to hit them. The first has a coin, and the second has the first appearance of Mario's sidekick and mount, Yoshi. Yoshi, left by himself, jumps around on the same spot, inviting the player to jump over the blocks and catch a ride. At this point, most players will either have seen Mario riding Yoshi on the cover art or in the game's opening, so it is not a stretch to believe that the player will know what to do. There is now a fair stretch of terrain that is completely empty, allowing the player to play around and understand how Yoshi controls. A little ahead, there is an information block. Those are the moments where the game breaks the whole teaching through gameplay principle and gives the player some verbal tutorials. In this case, the block teaches the player about the spin jump and how it can defeat some stronger enemies. It is certainly less elegant than teaching through gameplay, but as this is the first Mario game controlled by more than 2 buttons plus directionals, I can understand the heavy-handed approach. Of course, it's not like the developers completely gave up on teaching through gameplay. Placing this right after Yoshi is a deliberate decision, as players trying out the spin jump on Yoshi's back will immediately learn how that makes Mario jump off of Yoshi instead. Finally, we get to the first enemy that is really in Mario's way, and it is another situation that is not usually found in the game. A shellless Koopa walking into an empty shell. There is a clear arc of coins showing the player the way to jump on the Koopa. A lot can be learned from this. For those who didn't even jump so far, the game is showing that jumping damages enemies. A normal jump will show that Koopas can be ejected from their shells, and the player might also learn that shellless Koopas can simply be kicked away. For those who have Yoshi, a jump on the Koopa will show that Yoshi's jump is more powerful than Mario's normal jump. Finally, those who are still playing around with the spin jump have here a perfect opportunity to try it out and learn that it also destroys Koopas immediately. This Koopa is more or less equivalent to the first Goomba in Super Mario Bros. For the NES. It is the first enemy that's on Mario's way, and no one will get through this without learning how to jump. Let me take this opportunity to talk about the absence of a certain element that, in basically any other 2D Mario, would have been present since basically the first screen. Super Mushrooms. Those items make Mario grow and enable him to take an extra hit, but are deliberately absent so far. The reason is clear. Play up Yoshi's relevance. As I mentioned back in part 1, Yoshi serves as a power-up of sorts, as Mario can't get killed by enemies while riding it. By not giving players mushrooms, the developers make them focus on what's new in this game. Yoshi. Only those players who have already activated the Yellow Switch Palace and are therefore already familiar with the mushrooms from Yoshi's Island 1 will find mushrooms in this level, inside the yellow blocks. This keeps a completely new player from having to learn about both Yoshi and mushrooms one right after the other. After the first Koopa, there is another identical one right ahead, but without the coins to guide the jump. The repetition here is simply to give the player another try or further practice of the jumping mechanic. Maybe even try out a different type of jump. Mario now reaches a small ledge. While this game does have slopes, this level decides to use instead just block height variations. There isn't a single slope on the whole thing. As controlling Mario on slopes is notably harder, I assume the idea was to keep the whole thing as easy as possible for a first-time player. At this point, we are almost reaching the level's midpoint, and appropriately, the game throws a peak in player tension. I haven't talked much about this in the past, but when designing a level, you usually want the player's engagement and tension to increase slowly throughout the level, with increasing peaks followed by rest periods. I'll leave a link in the description for an episode of the amazing show Extra Credits on the subject. In this level, the midpoint is marked by the first apparition of a new enemy, the Charging Chuck. Those American football-based enemies charge at Mario with much higher speed than the Koopas. Not to mention they actually aim at Mario, instead of just moving back and forth. The Chucks also take 3 jumps to defeat, be them normal, spin or Yoshi jumps, and can't be damaged while they are recoiling from taking damage. To add to just how much stronger they are than Koopas, they can jump over ledges to reach Mario. Teaching that might be another reason this particular part of the level does not use slopes. The Chuck is a big difficulty spike, and the greatest challenge so far on the level, so the game appropriately rewards the player with the mid-level checkpoint. Those checkpoints not only make the player respawn from the middle of the level after a loss, but also give Mario a free super mushroom in case he's small, which is also the first situation in the level where this happens. Following onwards, there are 2 yellow pipes breaking the level in half, only there to break up the player's momentum and get them to jump some more. The second half of the level changes things a bit. The first half, which we just finished, is based around learning how shells work, learning how to jump on enemies, and finally facing a stronger enemy. From this point onwards, there are no more Koopa Troopas on the level. The enemy that takes the spotlight from this point onwards is another newcomer to the Mario series, the Monty Mouse. Before that though, there is another Yoshi egg in one of those 3 question blocks. It's a smart position to place one too, because the charging chuck the player just faced can easily scare the player's Yoshi away. Giving the player Yoshi here guarantees Mario will be ready and able to face whatever challenge comes next. Monty Mouse are enemies that spring from very visibly moving mounds of dirt in walls or in the floor a few seconds after they're visible on camera. After their initial jump, they charge at Mario, doing periodic short jumps and bouncing back from walls. They are easier to defeat than Koopas, as they don't require a spin jump or complicated shell maneuvers, but they're faster and the small jumps can catch the player off guard. Not only that, their positioning means they will attack Mario from above, which is a new situation. When your main weapon is jumping on top of enemies, it is naturally easier to face what comes at you from the same height or below than what comes from above. Right at the end of this elevated platform, there are 2 normal blocks just hanging there. Super Mario World's levels are full of optional areas, even beyond the ones that lead to extra exits. Those extra areas make the levels feel much bigger and richer, and usually reward the player with either dinosaur coins, which give an extra life after 5 are collected, or straight up extra lives. In this particular situation, the rightmost block spawns a climbable vine which leads to a cloud with 1 dinosaur coin. It's nothing really special, but it helps spice up things a bit. The eventual Game Boy Advance remake of this game increased the importance of the dinosaur coins, making every level have exactly 5 and tracking their collection, giving completionists something else to do. Those 2 initial Monty Mouse are followed by another one, also in an elevated platform. The player is forced to jump over this ledge though, possibly putting Mario in a collision course with the mole. It is strange, especially keeping in mind how more recent games introduce new enemies, how immediately aggressive with those moles the game is. Even more if we consider how early we are. If this was made today, I'm willing to bet there would first be a Monty Mole in a position out of the way where the designers could be sure the player wouldn't be below it when it jumped. Kind of like this. The blocks with the Yoshi egg are before the pipes, which are higher, and the first hill with the moles is much closer to the pipes, with both the lower and higher level aligned. With this change, the extra time the player will take to jump over the pipes will be enough for the mole circled in red to jump out. With the top platform aligned with the bottom one, the player will have plenty of time to observe the mole's running pattern safely, and will have all the information required to face more of them later. A little further right, there is another block that is activated by the yellow switch, another instance of rewarding players who explore with extra power-ups. Still on yellow switch blocks, here we have the first and only bottomless pit of the level. It is really hard to fall here even if you haven't activated the yellow switches, as you come in from an elevated position and the pit is only 2 blocks wide. If you're running, in fact, you don't even need to jump to clear the gap. The next screens have a spin on the Monty Mouse. Now they come from the ground instead of from walls. While they are easier to kill when coming from below, they are harder to see, and I believe that is the reason these are after the wall jumping ones. It is just 2 of them in fact, with nothing really making the second encounter different from the first one. Back to the exploration aspect, the purple pipe between the moles can be entered to reach a hidden area. This area has purple blocks that Mario can pick up and throw, and the challenge presented to the player is hitting the flying blocks with those blocks. One of those yields an extra life. Back upstairs, after the last Monty Mouse and another empty pipe, we have an exit pipe for the extra area I mentioned and a green pipe with a jumping piranha plant. Given that this area with the ground moles has a few pipes cutting through it, this might have been positioned as a twist on jumping over pipes. It is also worth noting that those plants can be bounced on with a spin jump or Yoshi. They are also notably different from their appearance in other games, jumping out of pipes instead of just appearing. I believe those 2 facts are connected, as the jumping plants can reach the height of a jumping Mario, and therefore can be a challenge even if the player spin jumps, as they still need to carefully time said jump. As is the case in most Mario games, the piranha plants do not come out of the pipe if Mario is close to the sides of the pipe. This avoids a possible frustrating situation where the player carefully approaches the pipe and jumps, only to be hit by a surprise plant. Less experienced players who go through the game very carefully and slowly have, therefore, a perfectly safe way of crossing those plants, while more experienced players still have to be careful with them if they want to go through faster. Finally, we reach the final stretch, and, just like before, we are faced with a charging chuck. Mario can just jump over it and hit a goal, but the extra objective here is hitting the P-switch held by these blocks, which will turn the line of coins into solid blocks, allowing the player to reach the ending line at the highest position. And that is the end of Yoshi's Island 2. If we compare this to the Mega Man level I analyzed last time, we can see some very clear differences. Mega Man games usually have only around 12 stages. The very first Super Mario Bros. Has 32 levels, while Super Mario World has around 70 levels, some with more than one exit, for a total of 96 end goals required for the player to complete it 100%. Not only that, but Mega Man also front-loads 8 of those levels, while Mario, despite the many paths, is much more linear. The result of that is that any given Mega Man level will probably be longer and certainly much harder to complete than most Mario levels. Mega Man has to make those levels count, but Mario can stand having some very simple levels at the beginning created specifically to allow players to get used with controlling Mario. Of course, Mario is also a much more complex game than Mega Man. The player has to control his jumps, momentum, learn how to handle shells, Fire Flower, Cape, and many other things, so it is also only natural that the game rolls itself out in a much slower pace than Mega Man. And that is all for today. I was originally going to condense both Yoshi's Island 1 and 2 in a single video, but I got a little carried away with writing, and this episode ended up much longer than expected. So, of course, on the next part of this series, we'll take a look at the surprisingly harder Yoshi's Island 1. Here's a quick question for those who are still watching. I usually alternate the series I'm doing videos on, like I did with Mega Man and Mario. Should I keep doing that now that I'm working on a 2-week schedule? Or should I instead change to doing only one game at a time until I'm done? Anyway, if I change that, it's gonna be after I'm done with Mario. As usual, thank you very much for watching this all the way to the end. If you're interested in more content, you can watch my videos on Pokemon, Undertale, and Mega Man. Also, please consider liking and subscribing or sharing on your platform of choice. Next time, we'll start looking at a new game. Once again, thanks for watching, and until next time.